Prehistoric Earth is often described with a sense of wonder. Vast landscapes, strange animals, a slower, simpler world before everything became complicated. From a distance, it almost feels peaceful. Like life back then followed fewer rules, fewer pressures, fewer consequences. But that feeling only exists because we're looking backward from comfort. Imagine for a moment that you could step into that world, not as an observer, but as a living body made of bone and flesh. No antibiotics, no surgery, no painkillers, no clean bandages. Just gravity, hunger, predators, and time working against you. Suddenly, the romance disappears. When people talk about prehistoric danger, they usually focus on the moment of violence, the attack, the fight, the clash between teeth and claws. That's the dramatic part, the part that looks good in illustrations and documentaries. But that's not where the real story begins. The truly disturbing question isn't how often animals were injured. It's how often they didn't die afterward. What really shows resilience isn't the bite itself, but the weeks, months, or even years that followed. Limping, bleeding, healing slowly in a world that never slowed down for pain. And the evidence for that survival is locked inside bone. One massive herbivorous dinosaur from the late Jurassic tells that story clearly. A creature built like a walking fortress, weighing several tons, designed to move constantly in search of food. At some point in its life, one of its legs shattered. Not cracked, not bruised, shattered under the kind of force that should have ended everything right there. Close your eyes and imagine that moment. Your entire body weight suddenly shifting onto a limb that can no longer support it. Every step sending shock waves through exposed bone. No splints, no rest. And stopping isn't an option, because stopping means starving. Here's the part that changes everything. The bone didn't stay broken. It healed. The fracture shows thickened regrowth, uneven but unmistakable. That kind of healing only happens if the animal stays alive long enough for weeks of inflammation, followed by months of slow repair. Which means it kept moving, kept feeding, kept surviving while carrying an injury that would put most modern animals down immediately. And pain doesn't exist in isolation. Blood loss would have come first, then swelling, then the constant risk of infection from dirt, parasites, and open tissue. Each step would have burned calories the animal could barely afford to lose. A simple stumble could have been fatal. Yet it lived. Not comfortably, not heroically. It lived because it had to. Built different in the most literal sense. The pattern doesn't stop there. An apex predator from roughly the same era shows a different kind of damage. This one hunted for a living. Speed, precision, and a working mouth were everything. At some point, part of its jaw was torn apart. Teeth were lost. Bone was crushed and left misaligned. Try to imagine eating like that. Tearing flesh when your mouth no longer closes correctly. Every bite reopening wounds. Every meal risking fresh bleeding. The giveaway, again, is healing. The bone remodeled itself. Scar tissue formed. The predator adapted its bite, likely changing how it hunted altogether. That adjustment would have taken time. Time spent vulnerable, weakened, and very aware that one mistake meant death. Blood loss leads to inflammation. Inflammation invites infection. Infection drains energy. Energy loss means failed hunts. Failed hunts mean starvation. It's a brutal chain reaction that modern medicine interrupts early. Back then, nothing did. And still, it survived. Long enough for its skeleton to record the struggle in detail. Just another Tuesday in a world that didn't care. By the time we reach smaller animals, the margin for error gets even thinner. One specimen shows trauma dangerously close to the brain. A blow that would have caused disorientation, loss of balance, maybe partial blindness. Now imagine waking up after that injury. The ground spinning, your movements delayed, predators everywhere. No safe place to recover, no understanding of what just happened to you. The skull tells us it didn't die right away. Bone around the injury reshaped itself slowly. That means days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Life continued under constant neurological stress. Each of these cases escalates the same question. How much pain can a living system absorb before it fails? And how often did survival come down to nothing more than stubborn momentum? Because as extreme as these injuries are, they're still individual, physical, biological. The next phase of this story pushes past that boundary. And once humans enter the picture, survival stops being just about bone strength. It becomes something far more unsettling.
As the injuries stack up, one uncomfortable truth becomes clear. Size doesn't guarantee safety. Strength doesn't prevent damage. In many cases, it actually makes survival harder, because a larger body means greater demands, more food, more movement, and more pain when something goes wrong. One prehistoric mammal from the Ice Age makes that painfully obvious. This animal lived in a world of cold ground, shifting seasons, and constant scarcity. At some point, it lost the functional use of one of its limbs. The joint was destroyed, not cleanly removed, but damaged enough to twist the bone out of alignment. Every step afterward would have been uneven, unstable, and exhausting. Close your eyes and imagine moving like that. One side of your body constantly compensating, muscles overworking, balance never quite returning. Every stumble risking a fall you might not recover from. The bones tell us this wasn't a short struggle. The damaged joint smoothed over time, the edges rounded. That only happens when an injury becomes permanent, and life continues anyway. Days turned into months, months into years. The pain chain here is relentless. Initial trauma leads to inflammation. Inflammation limits movement. Limited movement reduces access to food. Hunger weakens the immune system. Weak immunity invites infection. It's a slow collapse that doesn't look dramatic, but kills just as effectively. Except this one didn't die right away. It adapted. Not gracefully, but stubbornly. Likely slower than others, likely more cautious. Probably hunted less, scavenged more, avoided risks whenever possible. Survival through limitation rather than strength. Built to endure, not to dominate. Then the evidence shifts again, towards something even more disturbing. Another specimen shows signs of infection that spread through bone. Not a clean break, not a single traumatic event, This was damage that lingered, an open wound that never fully closed, tissue that became inflamed, then necrotic, then partially healed in stages. Imagine living with that. Constant pain, fever, weakness, the smell of decay attracting scavengers, no way to clean the wound properly, no understanding of what infection even is. The giveaway is the layered bone growth. The body tried again and again to isolate the damage. Each attempt left its mark. Each failure made the next stage worse. And still, the animal stayed alive long enough for that story to be written into its skeleton. By this point, the injuries stop feeling accidental. They feel inevitable. Like survival itself was less about avoiding harm and more about absorbing as much of it as possible without breaking completely. And then we reach the moment where this pattern stops being purely biological. When prehistoric humans enter the record, the rules begin to change. One early human skeleton shows trauma stacked on trauma. A healed skull fracture that would have caused disorientation and pain. A damaged arm that never fully regained strength. Signs of joint degeneration that suggest chronic mobility issues. Now imagine daily life like that. Not for days, not for weeks, for years. Hunting with reduced strength, walking long distances with constant pain, sleeping exposed to the elements. Any one of those conditions alone could be fatal. Combined, they should be impossible. Yet the bones show prolonged survival. This is where the question shifts from how to why. Because unlike animals, humans don't survive entirely alone. A broken hunter who continues to live implies something else happening in the background. Shared food, protection, time allowed for healing instead of abandonment. Close your eyes and imagine being unable to contribute fully, yet still being fed, still being defended, still being part of a group that sees your survival as worth the cost. That's not toughness. That's cooperation. The injuries themselves are brutal. The survival is even more shocking. Pain still followed the same chain. Blood loss, swelling, infection risk, long-term disability. But for the first time in this story, something interrupts that chain. Social support breaks the loop where biology alone would fail. This isn't romantic. It's not kindness in a modern sense. It's survival logic at the group level. A recognition, conscious or not, that keeping injured members alive strengthens the whole. And the bones quietly record that decision. Up until now, every case has shown life pushing against physical limits. The next stage pushes against something else entirely. Because some injuries don't just threaten survival. They redefine what survival even means. By this point, survival no longer feels impressive. It feels exhausting.
What stands out across these cases isn't strength or speed, but tolerance. The ability to keep functioning while the body is actively failing. And in some cases, the injuries aren't dramatic at all. They're subtle, slow, the kind that don't kill you quickly, but never stop hurting. One prehistoric individual shows damage to the spine. Not a clean break, but compressed vertebrae, partially fused in ways that suggest chronic pain. This wasn't a single accident. It was repeated stress, pressure building over time until movement itself became a problem. Close your eyes and imagine standing up every morning with pain that never resets. Turning your head sends sharp signals down your back.
Lifting anything heavier than your own arms feels dangerous. And yet, you still have to move, still have to forage, still have to stay alert. The bones show adaptation rather than recovery. Vertebrae thickened in the wrong places. Joints reshaped themselves to limit motion. The body wasn't healing. It was negotiating with damage. The pain chain here doesn't explode. It grinds. Chronic inflammation drains energy day after day. Limited mobility increases vulnerability. Sleep becomes shallow. Reaction time slows. Predators don't need you to be weak forever, just weak once. And still, this individual survived long enough for these changes to fully set in. Another case pushes the idea of tolerance even further. Evidence of severe facial trauma. Fractures around the nasal cavity and cheekbones, healed but distorted. The face would never have looked the same again. Breathing likely impaired. Vision possibly affected. Now imagine eating, breathing, and sensing the world through that damage. Every inhale a reminder. Every smell muted or wrong. Every facial movement pulling on scar tissue. This wasn't hidden. Other members of the group would have seen it constantly. A visible record of injury and survival walking among them. Again, the healing tells the timeline. This wasn't survival measured in days. It was months, possibly years. Long enough for bone to knit together imperfectly, locking the damage into the face forever. At this stage, a pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Injury didn't remove individuals from prehistoric life the way we might expect. It altered their role, slowed them, changed how they moved and contributed. Survival wasn't about returning to normal. Normal no longer existed. And then comes the most extreme implication of all. One human skeleton shows evidence of survival after what should have been a fatal combination of injuries. A severe head wound, limb trauma, degenerative joint damage, all present in the same individual. This isn't a coincidence. This is accumulation. Close your eyes and imagine living years after the first injury, only to suffer another, then another. Each one compounding the last, pain stacking instead of resetting, capability shrinking with every season. Biologically, this makes no sense. An animal with this many limitations should not outlast its peers, unless survival itself had shifted definitions. The bones suggest long-term care, time allowed for healing, food intake sufficient to sustain a disabled body, protection from threats that an impaired individual could not face alone. This isn't speculation built on hope. It's logic forced by evidence. Without support, this survival window collapses immediately, which means somewhere in that prehistoric landscape, a group chose not to abandon one of its own. Not once, but repeatedly, through multiple injuries, through long recovery periods, through diminished returns. That decision didn't erase pain. It didn't make life easier. It made survival possible. And this is where the story becomes uncomfortable, because it suggests that resilience wasn't just an individual trait. It was something shared, distributed, maintained by others, absorbing risk so someone weaker could keep breathing. By now, the question is no longer how much pain prehistoric life involved. That answer is obvious. The real question is, how often survival depended on others being willing to carry some of it. Because once that line is crossed, prehistoric life stops looking alien. It starts looking disturbingly familiar. By the end of this record, survival no longer looks like a miracle. It looks like a process, a slow, punishing filter that didn't care about comfort, fairness, or dignity. It cared only about what kept moving, breathing, and adapting long enough to leave evidence behind. Across species, the same truth keeps resurfacing. Injury wasn't the exception. It was part of the system. Broken bones healed crooked. Jaws adapted after being torn apart. Spines fused under pressure. Limbs learned new limits instead of regaining old strength. Survival didn't mean returning to what the body used to be. It meant becoming something else entirely.
Close your eyes and imagine that mindset. Not hoping to recover, not expecting relief. Just recalibrating daily life around pain that never fully leaves. Measuring every movement, every risk, every calorie spent. That kind of existence isn't dramatic, it's relentless. What makes these prehistoric cases so unsettling is how often survival happened without any sign of comfort. Healing occurred, but rarely cleanly. Adaptation came with permanent cost. And yet, life continued forward, not because conditions improved, but because stopping wasn't an option. In animals, that endurance feels brutal but straightforward. The body either adapts or it doesn't. The environment decides. In humans, it's different. The final human cases force a quiet realization. Some individuals lived far beyond what their injuries should have allowed, not because they were stronger, faster, or luckier, but because others changed the rules around them. Food shared when they couldn't hunt. Protection offered when they couldn't flee. Time granted when their bodies demanded it. This wasn't compassion in a modern sense. It was survival logic expressed socially instead of physically. A group investing resources into someone who no longer maximized efficiency. That choice carries weight. It means prehistoric life wasn't just about individual toughness. It was about systems, about groups absorbing loss to preserve continuity, about understanding, at least instinctively, that survival wasn't always optimized at the level of the strongest body. Pain still existed, disability still limited, death still waited close by. But survival expanded beyond muscle and bone. And this reframes how we see the prehistoric world. Not as a constant series of dramatic deaths, but as a long sequence of compromises. Bodies pushed past design limits, groups adjusting to internal damage, life continuing in forms that were slower, scarred, and visibly altered. The fossils don't celebrate this. They don't exaggerate it. They simply record it. A healed fracture means time passed. A remodeled joint means movement continued. A survived head injury means consciousness endured when it shouldn't have. Each mark is quiet, ordinary, and together they describe a world where survival wasn't clean or heroic. It was stubborn. If there's one pattern running through all these cases, it's this. Prehistoric life wasn't defined by violence alone. It was defined by what came after violence. The weeks of infection risk, the months of adaptation, the years of limitation. That aftermath is where most modern stories stop paying attention. But that's where survival actually happened. By the end, the question isn't how these creatures endured such injuries. The answer is written plainly in bone and behavior. They endured because the alternative was never an option worth considering. Life didn't ask whether it was fair. It just kept going.